Merci beaucoup à Madame Pounan qui avait un exposé très riche et qui allait très vite. Sans perdre du temps, je veux juste peut-être fixer 2 ou 3 points de ce qu'elle a dit pour permettre que les discussions se poursuivent. Alors, le premier point qui est la bonne nouvelle, c'est que la croissance est de retour en Afrique depuis un certain nombre de temps. Elle est assez robuste, mais il faut quand même mettre un bémol parce que, comme elle l'a dit, nous avons constaté que quand bien même il y a eu croissance sur la durée, lorsqu'on regarde la croissance du PIB par habitant, c'est ce qui est important, c'est ce qui va dans le panier de la ménagère, cette croissance est moins impressionnante. Moins impressionnante aussi à cause du taux de croissance démographique. Ce qui veut dire que quand bien même il y a eu des tentatives de réduction de la pauvreté, lorsqu'on regarde le nombre de pauvres, c'est-à-dire de façon absolue, le nombre de pauvres a augmenté sur la période, quand bien même le taux de pauvreté a diminué. Donc la première leçon que nous pouvons tirer, et je veux que nous gardons un peu ça dans l'esprit, c'est que la rapidité avec laquelle la pauvreté peut être réduite ne dépend pas seulement du taux de croissance économique. Mais il faut que la répartition des fruits de la croissance soit bien faite et qu'elle soit dirigée vers les pauvres. Le deuxième point, peut-être sur lequel nous devons peut-être fixer notre attention, c'est un peu le chemin de croissance en Afrique. De façon traditionnelle, lorsqu'on regarde, on va de l'agriculture vers l'industrie manufacturière. Mais lorsque vous regardez le chemin de croissance de l'Afrique, nous sommes allés de l'agriculture directement vers les services, en essayant de contourner l'industrie. Et dans son analyse, il ressort que par rapport à ce type de chemin, il y a un risque que la croissance que nous vivons aujourd'hui ne soit pas durable. Donc, il est tout à fait évident que si nous continuons à faire les choses comme nous le faisons, il est inutile de parler d'émergence. Il faut qu'il y ait une autre manière de faire les choses. Naturellement, ce que nous devons retenir, c'est que l'agriculture a connu une baisse dans sa contribution au PIB. Et plus grave, lorsqu'on regarde les exportations sont en diminution pour ce qui concerne les produits agricoles. Vous voyez, les exportations africaines croissent, mais c'est beaucoup plus les produits pétroliers, ce sont les minéraux. Donc, il faut aller vers plus de diversification. La dernière leçon que je vais tirer, pour ne pas être long, on reviendra là-dessus, c'est que, quoi qu'on dise, lorsqu'on regarde aujourd'hui, plus de 60 ou près de 60% des habitants en Afrique sont toujours dans le secteur agricole. Alors que nous voyons un déclin, aussi bien la productivité n'a pas augmenté comme il le faut, la contribution de la culture à la création de richesses a diminué. Qu'est-ce que ça veut dire en termes clairs? Ça veut dire que la croissance que nous avons eue n'a pas touché les plus pauvres. Parce que si vous voulez que la croissance touche les plus pauvres, il faut que la croissance ait lieu où travaillent ces pauvres. Ça, c'est une leçon fondamentale. Comment faire pour avoir une croissance plus inclusive? Elle a abordé quelques pistes, je ne vais pas insister là-dessus pour qu'on gagne du temps. Et nous allons partager les expériences de nos amis qui sont autour de la table. Et nous allons commencer par M. Roy, qui vient de l'Inde et qui nous fera un peu un exposé sur l'expérience de l'Inde en matière de transformation structurelle. Donc, M. Roy, vous avez la parole pour 5 minutes. 5 minutes, yeah.
Good morning. Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Moderator. I do have some slides, but I can't possibly use slides in 7 minutes. So I'll take you through the 3 major themes I have and spend a minute concluding. That should take 7. I'd first like to start by thanking UNDP, the World Bank, the African Development Bank, and of course the government of Cote d'Ivoire for inviting me. Listening to the keynote presentation, I realized that the India story, the India emergence story, is faced with the same challenges that the continent of Africa seems to face. And India this year is the fastest growing economy in the world. It's also reduced poverty in absolute terms and in relative terms at the fastest rate in human history, obviously after China. So I suppose the first message I'm getting listening to the keynote speaker is that the problems she has raised are not necessarily automatically binding constraints to growth, because we still have these problems, and we are growing fast, and we have reduced poverty. So if India has an emergence story, that is the immediate lesson I'm getting. But let me start by asking another question. What has India emerged from? I'd like to say that this notion of emergence is overgeneralized. China has emerged from something very different that India has emerged from. South Korea and the East Asian countries emerged from very different circumstances. Let me give you an obvious example. All Asian countries before China that emerged had their defense budgets completely underwritten by the United States thanks to the Cold War. And if I could get my defense budget underwritten, then I would also emerge much faster than I'm able to now. So that's a very different context. China's context is different, India's is different. India was traditionally an extremely poor performer, both on growth and poverty reduction. It had a reasonably equal income distribution, and like China, till the 1980s, very poor growth trajectory. India's emergence began, unlike China, because of a compulsion of a major balance of payments crisis that happened in 1991, which forced us to go to the IMF and forced us to undertake certain internal reforms. These reforms took about 11 to 12 years to complete. And then in about 2001, 2002, India began to grow very, very rapidly at the rates of growth that we are now used to, 7 to 8%, going up to, 7 to 8%, on a good day, 8.5 this year, with relatively low levels of inflation in those days. And that period of growth we saw from about 2002 till the global financial crisis was enough to bring India in just 6 years into the category of a lower middle income country. Although the income distribution worsened in that period also saw about 100 million people lifted out of poverty. Both happened simultaneously. Then came the global economic crisis, and India, for the first time, began to feel the pain of being an emerging economy. I've lived in Brazil, and I could never understand why the Brazilians were so obsessed with inflation. And now I do, because India began a short, sharp phase of very high inflation. And the big lesson we learned is that if you don't control inflation, once high inflationary expectations are formed, they stay. Today, we have, for example, controlled inflation. We have an inflation target of 4 to 6%. Inflation is down to less than 3%. But people expect inflation to be at least 10%, even now, in the surveys. So that's a very important lesson we learned. And as a result of that lesson, what India has now, for the first time as an emerging economy, is a very coherent macroeconomic framework. So we have now 3 targets: a fiscal deficit of not more than, nationally, 6% of GDP, inflation of not more than 6%, and a current account deficit of 1.5% of GDP. Those 3 constraints are surmountable, we find, to attain 8% growth. But what are the challenges? In the sense that while India does attain 8% growth from time to time, we are not China. We haven't shown a sustained 10-year period of continuous double-digit growth. So we are, like you, feeling our way. We know we've done 8%, and we're trying to ask ourselves, is this 8% sustainable? And what do we do to give ourselves greater confidence that it could be sustainable? What are the challenges? One of the challenges that we have is, because we have high inflationary expectations, our interest rates for private investment tend to be, if you compare emerging economies, I do have a slide, it's in my paper, at the higher end of the emerging economy spectrum. We tend to be up there with resource-rich economies, which typically have high interest rates, like Brazil and Russia. We're not down there with Indonesia, with Turkey, with China. And this is a major challenge for us. The second challenge is an unexpected one, and that is what I call the common, I'm sure my Chinese friend, I hope you'll comment on this, the common challenge all emerging economies face with respect to China. India, we always complain that our productivity is low. But actually, when I did the research, I found that India's productivity has been catching up since 80, with every other emerging economy in the world. And in 2005, India's total factor productivity was the same as, in the same ballpark as China, Korea, you name it. All the emerging economies had come together. But after 2005, the emerging economies, all of us, stayed at the same level of productivity. China's productivity doubled. Now, the implication for us is very worrying, and there's a lesson here, I think, for Africa. Indian wages today, Chinese wages average, are 2.5 times greater than India. But their productivity is 5 times greater than India, which means that even though we are cheaper than China, no one's going to relocate to India or anywhere else till we improve productivity. And this is a major lesson. It's not just about low wages, it's also about keeping pace with the productivity of the market leader, which happens to be in our era, in our age, China. And this is as true for Africa as it would be for India. I'll take 2 minutes more, Chair. In terms of structural transformation, we face the same problem as you. Actually, agriculture as a proportion of GDP has declined dramatically over the last 15 years. But the labor force in agriculture has only begun declining now. And therefore, what we have is a number of people employed in agriculture, but there's no work there. So one of the challenges we have is to bring them into modern activities like services and industry. But there the challenge is that we are unable to deal with urbanization. And this is not a new phenomenon. If you look at the evolution of London or New York or Paris, these were filthy cities during the Industrial Revolution. And it took them 120 years to become what they are now. But we don't have that sort of time. My final point is a lesson that India has not learnt. I'm going to skip the fiscal story, it's in my paper. There is a fiscal issue which is interesting, which we have not learnt from other Asian economies. And this is paradoxical because the one thing that India should have learnt is the human development story. By 2030, India will be the 4th largest economy in the world. We'll have the youngest working age population in the world. And we will be just below China in terms of per capita GDP growth and about 20% below in terms of absolute GDP if all goes well. But the problem in India is human development. India ranks below every emerging economy in the world, and for that matter, even below Bangladesh, which is a much poorer neighbor of ours, in terms of youth literacy, in terms of life expectancy, in terms of under 5 mortality, in terms of the quality of primary education, in terms of public spending on education, in terms of healthcare provided, in terms of spending on health. But India is the number 2 high-growth economy in the world. This is a lesson we ought to have learned from other Asian emerging economies, all of which made sure that when they were growing, they increased rapidly investment in human development. We have not been able to do that, and this is a challenge that we have not yet been able to address. And it sounds paradoxical in conclusion, because people think of India as a land of engineers and professionals, etc. But actually, if you compare the quality of human development investment we have and the results we're getting from it, that is the soft spot, the weak underbelly, and I suspect the next generational challenge we will have. And again, this resonates tremendously for high-capacity, educated African economies, because that high-capacity education, when you do it at a smaller scale, when growth happens and you scale up, you can suddenly find yourself very, very short, and that's the painful lesson we're learning now. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup. Je vois que beaucoup d'efforts. Alors, pour ne pas perdre du temps, sa conclusion paradoxale me semble être le centre de l'intervention. Deuxième économie en termes de croissance du PIB, mais il nous a dit en développement humain, et c'est un défi. Ce qui veut dire, ce n'est pas la croissance économique, la croissance en elle seule qui est le centre de l'émergence. Deuxième point, il a parlé des statistiques. Quand il a commencé son intervention, ce qui veut dire que dans nos pays, nos appareils statistiques sont très faibles. Comment mesurer ce développement humain si les appareils statistiques sont faibles? Donc, les questions de statistiques, et le Premier ministre Loum en a parlé hier, me semblent être des points importants. Alors, je ne vais pas prendre moi plus de temps, je vais permettre au présentateur de le faire, mais le dernier point qu'il a dit, qui ne semble pas être un point que les gens partagent, il faut toujours un cadre macroéconomique cohérent. Il ne faut jamais perdre de vue que la plateforme sur laquelle on bâtit c'est un cadre macroéconomique cohérent. Il faut avoir des ambitions, mais pas des ambitions qui demain vous amènent à une aventure que vous n'avez pas souhaitée. Et sur ce point, je vais inviter notre ami du Brésil, M. Celso, à prendre la parole.
Bonjour à tous. J'ai aussi une présentation, un diapo, mais j'essaierai de le faire tout de suite, très vite. Et seulement quelques diapos, s'il vous plaît, les premières. Bonjour à tous, merci pour l'invitation. On m'a demandé de parler sur l'expérience du Brésil en matière de transformation structurelle. Je suis heureuse que je n'ai pas appelé pour parler du football. Parce qu'après, le Brésil a pris 7 buts de l'équipe allemande. Il est plus sage que les champions de l'Afrique qui parlent de ces sports aujourd'hui. En fait, nous sommes ici aujourd'hui pour partager des informations et connaître des autres efforts entreprises dans ce même sens et qui puissent servir également de référence au Brésil. Voici donc l'expérience que nous pouvons partager sans avoir la prétention de dicter des modèles, car chaque pays, chaque peuple crée et même leurs propres solutions. Mon objectif aujourd'hui est de vous raconter brièvement ce que nous avons réalisé au Brésil depuis 2003, année où Lula da Silva a été élu président pour la première fois. Mon point de départ à la première déclaration publique de Lula au moment où il était élu. Il disait, ce que j'ai soigné, ce qui m'a sorti de mon gouvernement, tous les Brésiliens puissent faire 3 repas par jour. C'est à partir de ce but qu'il a commencé à fonder les structures qu'il considère nécessaires pour relever à ces défis. Il affirmait qu'il était primordial d'inclure les pauvres dans les budgets d'État. Il a ainsi créé le ministère du Développement social et de la lutte contre la faim pour coordonner exclusivement les programmes sociaux. Il a constitué le ministère du Développement agraire pour s'occuper exclusivement de l'agriculture familiale, qui est responsable aujourd'hui de 70% de la nourriture qui arrive à tous les Brésiliens. Le ministère de l'Éducation est devenu la priorité majeure du gouvernement. Il a renforcé des banques de développement et de 2 banques publiques pour élargir l'accès des plus pauvres au crédit. L'ensemble des ministères et d'organes publics a été appelé à travailler de façon intégrée et motivée pour un seul objectif, la lutte contre l'exclusion sociale. En ce sens, le budget annuel du gouvernement a reçu une dotation pour la réalisation d'une série de programmes sociaux et de politiques publiques à cette fin. L'idée était d'associer 3 ensembles de programmes pour insérer le Brésil dans la voie du développement. Les programmes d'inclusion sociale des politiques publiques, un programme de travaux publics pour construire l'infrastructure exigée pour un pays de dimension continentale et un programme audacieux de production d'aliments associant l'agriculture familiale prédominante dans le pays à agrobusiness indispensable pour produire rapidement en grande quantité. Et faire face aussi, de cette façon, à la situation d'insécurité alimentaire qui touchait 11% des populations du pays. La figure centrale des programmes sociaux est le programme Bourse Famille, Bolsa Família. Il répond aux besoins de 14,1 millions de familles, près de 54 millions de personnes, les quarts de la population brésilienne. Il coûte approximativement 9,5 milliards d'euros, près de 0,5% du PIB du Brésil. Les premières pas par son exécution a été, comme disait mon ami Tarsius, la réalisation d'un travail de terrain aboutissant à la création d'un registre unique. Ça veut dire un recensement identifiant de façon précise les familles les plus démunies du pays. Ces familles ont reçu une carte contenant leurs données qui leur permettait de retirer mensuellement une somme en espèces directement auprès des agences de banque publique. Les montants reçus sont en moyenne de 20 €. Les cartes sont délivrées préférentiellement aux femmes, car ce sont elles qui sont les responsables des soins donnés aux enfants. Pour assurer cette prestation, les programmes exigent l'accomplissement de 3 conditions. La première, que les enfants soient maintenus à l'école. La deuxième, que la femme enceinte réalise tous les examens prénataux. La troisième, que les enfants soient vaccinés régulièrement contre les maladies les plus communes. Les familles qui n'accomplissent pas ces normes perdent le droit de recevoir cette aide financière. Les familles qui arrivent à améliorer leur situation et accroître leurs revenus et qui quittent ainsi la ligne de pauvreté renoncent à la bourse famille. En 2014, 1,5 million de familles ont ainsi quitté les programmes. Beaucoup de personnes se sont demandé s'il ne sera pas plus approprié de distribuer des aliments à la place de l'argent. L'explication est simple. Pour tuer la faim, il ne suffit pas d'avoir accès à la nourriture. D'autres ont dit que les programmes encourageaient la indolence. Les Brésiliens qui pensaient ainsi faisaient preuve d'un préjugé cruel, celui de considérer que les personnes sont pauvres par paresse, lorsqu'en vérité, ce qui leur manque effectivement sont des opportunités. Mais le programme Bourse Famille a un autre aspect qui est très important de faire ressortir. Il dynamise les commerces locaux et la consommation d'autres produits de base en plus des aliments. À ceux qui considèrent difficile de mettre en œuvre ces programmes, je voudrais l'encourager à commencer à implanter dans une région du pays et à développer peu à peu. Plusieurs gouvernements africains comme le Sénégal, l'Angola et le Soudan étudient aujourd'hui la mise en place de programmes similaires aux bourses famille. Et notre programme le plus important de distribution de revenus, mais il opère intégration avec des autres programmes, les programmes d'acquisition d'aliments, qui est un programme très important pour ceux qui habitent la campagne. Je vais finir, mon cher ami, en démontrant seulement quelques photos. Comment fonctionne-t-il? Les petits agriculteurs bénéficiant de l'aide technique de l'IMPRAPA, notre entreprise de recherche agricole et agropastorale, reçoivent un crédit spécial des banques publiques. Les crédits offerts aux petits agriculteurs passent de 2,8 milliards de reais à 28 milliards de reais au cours de la dernière récolte, ce qui correspond à près de 9 milliards d'euros. Cette aide leur a permis d'augmenter les productions. Mais à qui vont-ils vendre ces excédents de production en demande? Les gouvernements achètent ces aliments et utilisent pour les repas scolaires et les enfants dont l'alimentation quotidienne est assurée un motif de plus pour aller à l'école. Aujourd'hui, toute l'école publique brésilienne offre des repas scolaires aux élèves et tous les enfants brésiliens ont accès à l'école. Ça, c'est les programmes d'acquisition d'aliments à l'Afrique. Il y a déjà 2 ans, on a commencé à appliquer les programmes d'acquisition d'aliments dans le Sénégal, le Niger, le Malawi, l'Éthiopie et le Mozambique. Ces photos-là sont des photos de l'intérieur de l'Éthiopie, une production d'un petit agriculteur et après les enfants qui mangent les résultats de cette production. On a beaucoup de programmes pour les présenter, les programmes Plus d'aliments, qui est déjà à Ghana, Kenya, Sénégal, Mozambique et Zimbabwe, qui devront offrir plus de 2000 tracteurs dans des conditions spéciales de crédit. Mais je pars tout de suite pour finir, parce que le temps est très petit. Je dois finir avec seulement un mot de président Tula, ça c'est celui-là au Bénin. Il dit, pour finir ma présentation, c'est dommage que c'est très vite, mais je dois respecter le temps. Il n'est pas possible de parler de paix dans un monde qui souffre encore la faim. Toute action contre la violence politique sera vaine s'il n'a pas d'opportunité de vie digne pour des centaines de milliers de personnes qui vivent dans la périphérie d'un monde qui concentre la richesse. C'est ça notre combat. Je vous remercie.
Merci beaucoup pour cet exposé très pratique qui en réalité complète l'exposé de Mme Pounan. Je ne vais pas insister là-dessus. Le point qui me semble intéressant, c'est cet aspect de redistribution des fruits de la croissance. Comment on les redistribue? Et là, il nous a parlé un peu de l'instrument budgétaire. Comment, à partir du budget, on peut adresser un peu ces différentes contraintes que connaissent les pauvres pour les insérer aussi dans une dignité de vie. Et il nous a fait part de plusieurs exemples de distribution des espèces de monnaie, distribution d'aliments, nous allons revenir là-dessus, mais je pense que ce qu'il a dit complète ce que Mme Pounan a dit dans les perspectives et sans doute dans les conclusions, nous verrons comment le prendre en compte. Alors, ceci dit, je vais très rapidement donner la parole à notre ami, après le Brésil, c'est Maurice. Très bien. À la Corée, avant à Maurice. OK.
Hello, could you unload? Good morning. It gives me a great pleasure to be here. Thank you for this opportunity to give to the presenting this about Korean experience. I will try to make it very short because I have very limited time. This is what I'm going to tell you today, overview and how Korea has been successfully transformed structurally, and then what are the key success factors, and what are the implications to the African context, and then I will bring some conclusion. As you may remember, Korea was as far as many African countries in 1960s. And we had a political turmoil in the later part of the 1950s and the 60s, and we had a military coup in the early 60s. And then we move on to a big jump in terms of industrialization, focusing on so-called export-oriented industrialization. In the 1970s, big push, meaning that we invested a lot in heavy and chemical industries. And in the 80s, we had a very rapid improvement in the IT sector and the structural adjustment. And in the 1990s, we had a financial crisis, which made it Korea very difficult, but we overcome those difficulties. And after year 2000, we are still progressing. As you can see from this table, even I myself was surprised that during the last 14 years, since 2014, the total amount of export was more than tripled, meaning that Korean economy is still progressing. We are very focusing on few products, including electronic goods, automobiles, computer, chemical product, and shipbuilding. Compared to just 4 years ago, those key main industries are still doing reasonably well. This is just showing that how Korean economy has been transformed since 1960s. In 1960s, we are focusing on labor-intensive industries like producing wax and some textile goods until middle of the 1970s. After that, we move on to much more capital-intensive industries like automobile, shipbuilding, and you can name it. In 1980s onward, we have been focusing on IT industries. So now, more than 84% of our export products are all the product which I just mentioned, 5 key areas. So how Korean industries has been have been transformed because it was a very likely, say, export-driven economy because we have a very limited domestic market. We have a 50 million, but we knew that with the 50 million without much natural resources, it would be very difficult to grow our own industries. What do? We try to exploit foreign markets. So if you see this picture, you can see that government supported the private sector, private enterprises, and then private enterprises worked very well with some good, well-educated, skilled labor, and then we all imported industrial material, and then we exported, and then with this foreign earning from foreign hard currency, we tried to even develop further. So let me go through structural transformation since 1960s. Make it short, as I said, 60s, it was labor-intensive industries. Last 2 days, yesterday and today, we talked about the transformation from agricultural sector to industrial sector and the service sector. But I'm going to tell you, Korean transformation, especially structural transformation from labor-intensive industries, and moving on to much more capital-intensive industries. Now we call it knowledge or technology-intensive industries. This is what is happening in Korea since the 1960s. I'm not going to go in detail because I have a very limited time. 1980s, we are still on the move, and during that time, actually, during 1960s and 70s, even trade union movement was suppressed by the government. It was a very late of 1980s when government allowed the trade unions to strike. And during that time, with the heavy engagement in heavy and chemical industries, government created huge conglomerates called the Jaebol. Jaebol, you can remember that like Samsung, Hyundai, SK, those are all big conglomerates. These conglomerates were driving forces of the Korean economy. Of course, there are some debates about what happened to the small and medium-sized industries, but there are so many other things which we can discuss. These conglomerates are engaged in, which I said, 5 key industries. All those key industries are heavily dependent upon government support programs in the early stage of development. And 1990s and the year 2000 after, we know that 1997 we had the Asian financial crisis. And there is a saying that if the industries are too big, it is very difficult to wait, too big to fail. But in later part of the 1990s, like Daewoo, it was number 4 Jaebol in Korea, it was failed. So it means that Korean economy became much more stronger after this crisis because we know that after rain, the soil will be much more hardened, isn't it? And then with the development of IT sector, we have, say, heavily engagement in IT sector, which made it possible for e-government. It is not only that, science and technology, innovation, IT, BT, NT, those are key areas which government try to pursue for the sustainable development. But there are so many different stories. In order to achieve those kinds of knowledge or technology-intensive industries, government started to educate people from later part of the 1960s, meaning that if you want to focus on such advanced economies, you need to educate and train people beforehand, at least 10 or 20 years beforehand. What are the key success factors? I just want to draw only 2 key issues. One from public sector's point of view, 2 from private sector's point of view. One from public sector. Government, we had very effective, say, macroeconomic policies, like 5-year economic development plans. And the industrial policies. Government guided what kinds of industries we have to develop now or later. So we prioritized all the industries. What are the monetary and the physical policies? I have so many things to tell you. Monetary policy is very important because the government need to have a sufficient revenue, also at the same time provide other goods and services. And the industrial zones, even export promoting policies. Even SOCs, state-owned enterprises, were very well managed. One example is like POSCO. POSCO was established in 1968, one of the top steel-making companies in the world. Why it became so competitive? Because we started very early. And how about the social over the capital? Government provided very good infrastructure. Move on to private sector. You know, when you have a private sector, yesterday, today, we know that private sector should be leading force of the economy, or should be in the driving seat of the car for the engine of the growth. What you need in the private sector is a human capital in terms of management, in terms of entrepreneurship, in terms of skills and the technologies. So many things you will be able to talk about the human capital. Another thing is motivation. They have to work very hard. I put a word, to be or not to be, that is the question. When we do business, if I fail this business, I will die. Otherwise, they can survive. That's the Korean spirit. What are the implications to the African context? Looking at the public sector, we need political stability, and we talked about the security as well. And what the government to do is, government need to provide good, conducive business environment, in a sense that they will provide very good, educated people with human capital. I always say that when you have many people with these human beings or human resources, but when people are educated and trained, we call it human capital. Capital is a very good word, isn't it? Capital is something which you can produce for the society. How about the social infrastructure? We have a very good system of social infrastructure or social over the capital. Trade union movement. And nowadays, environmental protection became very important because of global warming. Just the last 10 over years, Korean government has been very focusing on so-called environmentally friendly economic growth, or GGGI, you may remember, Global Green Growth Initiative, initiated by Korean government. Because we know that during Korean industrialization, we made many mistakes in terms of environmental degradation. We want to protect. We do not want to have the same experience with African countries. We want to share our technologies which could bring less environmental damage during the course of industrialization. That's what Koreans are trying to do. How about the private sector development? As I said, you need good entrepreneurship. Yes, it will be only 2 more minutes. And also, those entrepreneurs, even ordinary labor or skilled workers, even unskilled, they need to have some degree of patriotism, I wrote here, as self-esteem, and they have to follow government policies. Why? Because government is trying to bring long-run or rather say forward-looking behavior in the future and the sustainable development. Let me conclude that. I think there are many lessons which African countries can learn from Korean experience. Just looking at the public sector, we call it sound macroeconomic policies. Africa needs very good sound macroeconomic policies, monetary, fiscal policies, industrial policies, good governance as well. I just jumped it because Korea did a good job in terms of e-government system. E-government system made the Korean public sector, also private sector, very, very effective. Why? We reduced the corruption a lot, and then everything If you go into the Korean ministry's homepage, you can see how they are spending money, how they are setting the policies, and how they are implementing those policies. How about the private sector? You need to have a very good entrepreneurship, including some skills. And entrepreneurship means that risk-taking behavior. Of course, in the early stage of Korean economic development, government protects some degree of risks by guaranteeing their bank loans or whatever. And the social factors, you need to build up human capital. I think I didn't take too much time. Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup pour votre partage d'expérience. Je pense que nous allons très rapidement passer au dernier exposant pour faire peut-être une synthèse des résumés, notre ami de Maurice.
Okay. Merci, Monsieur le Président, but I speak in English, if you don't mind. So, I think everything has been said, really, about what were the conditions that made transformation possible in many of the countries. So I will try not to go over them again. Last week, exactly 1 week ago, Mauritius completed its 47 years of independence. Now, 47 years ago, where were we? We depended 98% of our exports on sugar, and the rest 2% was on tea. Within the 47 years of independence, we have moved from being a monocrop economy to a highly diversified economy today. Sugar represents less than 3% of GDP today, whereas in the 70s it represented about 25% of GDP. So the other sectors that have grown are tourism, industrialization, manufacturing of garments especially. Soon after independence, we knew we had to break away from the dependence on sugar. Therefore, we encouraged the setting up of EPZ, export processing zones, to have an outward-looking strategy. But even there, one thing that we did, which was an innovation, though we copied from other countries, because we've never believed that we should go on reinventing the wheel, we looked at other countries like Taiwan and Ireland that had set up export processing zones, and we decided to set up EPZs, but which were not geographical zones, but which were legal entities. So instead of having dedicated zones, though we had a couple of them with industrial estates, we said that any enterprise which came and invested for exports would get an export enterprise certificate, and wherever it produced in the island, it would be considered as part of an export processing zone. And the idea was that instead of getting everybody concentrated in one place, we could have jobs taken to where people lived. So the EPZ has been quite a success. Then tourism. 1968, when we became independent, we had 17% unemployment. In 1990, we had less than 2% unemployment. But today we have got 8% unemployment. So it is a cycle. The question is, can we make development sustainable? Now, to see what has been achieved, in 1968, our GDP was about $400 per capita. Today it's about $10,000 per capita. There were other countries like Ghana and so on, I think, which were much better, higher up the ladder than us. But then there was also Singapore, which was about the same place as us in 1970, and which today is about 4 times better off than us. So success is always relative, but it also depends on what you're giving to your people. Maybe just to show the progress that has been made, I'll just give you a quote from Stiglitz, Joseph Stiglitz, who wrote about the Mauritius miracle, which I think is a very bad term. In economics, there are no miracles. If you believed in miracle, you know, you take candles and you go and pray, and things will change. But I think we have to look at, you know, how people work, how the economy is structured, etc. But he said, suppose someone were to describe a small country that provided free education through university for all of its citizens, transportation for school children, and free healthcare, including heart surgery for all. You might suspect that such a country is either phenomenally rich or on the fast track to fiscal crisis. But Mauritius, a small island nation off the east coast of Africa, is neither particularly rich nor on its way to budgetary ruin. Nonetheless, it has spent the last decade successfully building a diverse economy, a democratic political system, and a strong safety net. Now, how did this happen? There is a paper, I think, which I have already given to UNDP, which I suppose will be circulated. So I won't go into the details of it because we don't have time. I will just go on the lessons. I think it's better just a few of the lessons which have not been mentioned maybe, or maybe mentioned in different ways. First of all, I'm assuming that everybody knows where Mauritius is. It's off the east coast of Madagascar. And like I was telling our friend here, you've got the 1.2 billion of people represented here, and I am from 1.3 million people. So we are at a different end of the spectrum. But the process of development, of transformation, is the same. You know, scale may differ, but the process is the same. Now, we are an island of about 2,400 square kilometers. But recently, we've signed a treaty with Seychelles, and now we've got 2.3 million square kilometers of maritime zone. So Mauritius, now we are talking of a blue economy. We have to get away from the land economy and go to the blue economy. And because as a small country, economic transformation or structural transformation is not a one-off business. It happens, you know, almost every decade, every 15 years, you have to reinvent yourself and you have to change. Now, transformation is painful. As somebody told me, you know, there is no gains, no pain, no gains. It was a Chinese who told me that. He said, no pain, no gains. You know? So we have to accept that if you're going to have economic transformation, there is going to be pain. So the question is, how do you make the population accept to bear the hardships? And this is where political leadership becomes very important. You need to have what we've been talking about, a lot of people have been talking about the developmental state. And when we're talking about the state, it means the legislators, the executive, you know, the cabinet, the ministers, and the public service, the administration, have to be geared towards development and not filling up pockets of some people in the country. And while it has been said that private sector is very important for growth, in Mauritius, the government has often played the role of catalyst. The government has pushed the economy in certain directions, has led the way, but with the support of the private sector. There has been always discussions, dialogue between public and private sector to develop a consensus nationally on the direction in which we wanted the country to grow. So national consensus on the way forward is essential. If you don't have that consensus, then every 5 years you change governments and you change direction, and in the end you would see you going around in circle. Then the quality of human resources and institutions are very important. For Mauritius, we had only our people. So that's why we had free education from the beginning, and we always invested in education. And even when we had the structural adjustment program with the World Bank in the 1980s, which helped Mauritius, I think one of the rare success stories of structural adjustment. But it worked because we just didn't take on board everything that the bank told us. We discussed with them and we agreed on certain things that were important for us, like education was important, keeping the welfare state was important, so we maintained this, but we became better at macroeconomic management, the policy, the fiscal policies, etc. Yeah. Fourth, you need a culture of ethical work and productivity. You know, this is very important if you want to maintain. Now, the public-private sector dialogue is important, it was important, but it must be geared towards improving the business climate in the country generally, and not aimed at rent-seeking. It's not lobbying activities to get benefits only for a small group of people, but it is to make the business climate better. And finally, like you've seen from that quote from Stiglitz, I think the benefits of the growth must be distributed in a fair and equitable manner, and must be seen to be distributed in a fair and equitable manner. Now, there is also an element that people often we haven't been speaking about, which is the global context. Mauritius managed to do the transition because we live in a world where there was protection. The Lomé Convention, the Commonwealth Sugar Agreement before that, and Cotonou, etc., helped us grow. So we benefited from the global environment. We seized the opportunities in the global environment, and today the global environment is different, so we have to find new ways of going forward. And this is why now we are at a stage where we're trying to see in which new direction should we transform the Mauritian economy, and where the sea is becoming very important, and where collaboration with others, regional integration, etc., have become very important. So I think I'll leave on that, because before the chairman tells me to stop. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup. Alors, nous devions terminer à 10h45. Nous avons commencé avec 30 minutes de retard. Je souhaiterais que si nous rajoutons ces 30 minutes, en tout cas à 11h30, nous déposons le micro. Le président a fait ses conclusions. Nous respecterons nos 1h45.